Hi again, my radio friends. My name is Tom. You are watching the Radiodog channel. And today, part two of my very short series on Intro to Shortwave. In my previous video, I spent some time describing what shortwave is, primarily in its relationship to the other more well-known radio bands. But today, I am going to talk a little bit more about what you can listen to on shortwave, what is actually there to listen to. So let's get started. Now, before I get too far into what you can hear on shortwave, let me talk about modes. A mode is a way that radio signals carry useful information, in this case, music or voice or whatever. Now, radio energy is, of course, a natural phenomenon, but human beings, we're very crafty and clever, and we've learned how to domesticate this radio energy and to create it and to use it to carry information, such as music or news or whatever it is that you happen to listen to on the radio. And so we call this modulation. Modulation. Now, you already know about two modes that are very common, and you'll see their abbreviations right here, FM and AM. These are the different methods of using radio waves to carry information. FM stands for frequency modulation, and AM stands for amplitude modulation. Now, I promise not to get too technical here, so if you want to learn more about these modes in depth, you can Google it for yourself and get as many answers as you want. So the M in FM and AM stands for the same thing, modulation. Now, FM is not typically used on shortwave radio. The mode most commonly heard is AM, or amplitude modulation, or some derivative of it. But we'll get back into modes here in a little bit. So what kinds of things are there to listen to on shortwave? And today I'd like to break it down into four categories: broadcast programming, amateur radio, utility stations, and this wonderful category I'm calling mysterious. So let's look at the first one, broadcast programming. This is a fairly broad category of transmissions, and these are mostly in the AM mode. So these signals are basically the same kind of signals that you hear on your AM radio, and the difference being because of the behavior of these waves at higher frequencies, they bounce off of the atmosphere and again off of land or water, and therefore on shortwave these AM signals travel great distances. So among the things you can listen to on shortwave radio, you can hear the BBC, you can hear Deutsche Welle out of Germany, you can hear Radio Moscow, Radio Netherlands, and sorry, I was reading the 1990 version. Okay, well, you can still hear the BBC, you can hear Radio Australia, that was the 2000 version. Okay, well, let's face it, a lot of these international stations are no longer in existence, and at least stations that are broadcasting in English to North America, many of those have stopped broadcasting, and the principal reason for that is because of the advent of the internet and how in North America most people get their news and their information and their entertainment over the internet. So therefore there's not a great market. Not that shortwave broadcasting was ever a huge market, but it's even less so now. Now, there are still a couple of international broadcasters. There's China Radio International, Radio Romania of all things, a few others. But not nearly so much as there used to be. But in a large portion of the world, which is not reliably connected on the internet, shortwave radio still fills a very useful function. And so it's a bit of a sport here in the States to listen to very weak transmissions from around the world. Sometimes those transmissions are not necessarily intended for North America, and so that in some ways makes it a little more challenging. Of course, another aspect of broadcast programming is religious programming, and spend a few minutes on the dial on shortwave and you will find lots of religious broadcasters, some that are popping up all the time. These religious stations tend to be rather fringy, end of the world kind of things, but they can be pretty entertaining to listen to. You can find those also. In addition to international broadcasters, you can also, there are also a handful of commercial shortwave stations. Not a whole lot. Most of the commercial ones are programming, religious programming, so it's kind of hard to tell the difference. And finally, there is something called pirate radio. Pirate radio is radio broadcasts that are unlicensed by any country or any authorized agency. Someone who has a transmitter and can secretly transmit these stations. Usually a pirate radio broadcasts kind of an odd mix of music and usually some kind of oddball stuff. And because they are operating outside of the law, they are somewhat unpredictable. You never know where they're going to pop up or when they're going to pop up. And again, it's something of a sport to be on the lookout and listening for pirate radio stations. You might check out websites like shortwaveschedule.com, and that lets you know what stations are broadcasting, on which frequency, and the schedule of those transmissions. And one thing to remember about all shortwave transmissions, they aren't like the stations you might listen to on your AM radio. Sometimes those broadcast 24 hours a day. Shortwave stations operate according to schedules which depend on the ability of their operating frequencies to propagate or to travel through the atmosphere and go long distances. So the schedules are constantly changing, and with many stations, their frequencies are changing. Sometimes they are on higher frequencies during the day, and they might switch to a much lower frequency at night when the propagation is better. But we're only just scratching the surface on shortwave, because there's another big aspect to shortwave listening, and that is something called amateur radio, or often referred to as ham radio. Ham radio operators, or radio amateurs, are licensed by their governing authority to operate two-way communications on a variety of frequencies throughout the radio dial. And if you, in your neighborhood, perhaps you see that house that it has kind of all of these antennas and wires and everything kind of popping up all over the place, you can be sure that there is a ham that lives there. That is part of the aspect to the hobby, is having radios and antennas to transmit and to communicate with hams throughout the world, basically. Again, those shortwave frequencies have the ability to propagate and to bounce off things and to go great distances, and that makes the amateur radio hobby very appealing and a whole lot of fun. Now, don't be fooled by the term amateur. You might think that there's just a bunch of guys that really don't know what they're doing. Many amateurs are very, very knowledgeable, skilled, and sometimes they're also professional radio or electronics people, and have very sophisticated radios and antennas and computers and all kinds of things to help them in utilizing these radio waves for two-way communication. There really is a large gamut. I happen to be a radio operator myself, but I am on the much closer to the typical meaning of amateur. I have very modest equipment and don't get that heavy into it, but some radio amateurs have just, the sky's the limit in terms of what they can do. Radio amateurs are limited in terms of the power that they can use to transmit, and they're also limited. By a certain range of frequencies that they're allowed to use, but more on that in a minute. Now let's get back to this mode business that I talked about at the beginning. While AM is the primary mode for broadcast stations, AM is not used nearly as frequently by radio amateurs. And radio amateurs use a variety of modes to communicate. A common mode in ham radio is called single sideband. Single sideband, or usually abbreviated SSB, is derived from AM signals, but parts of that signal have been suppressed or eliminated in order to make transmissions more efficient for the station doing the transmitting, and also using much less space on the radio spectrum, much less bandwidth. For the listener, for you, that means because hams use different modes, you need some special circuitry in your radio to hear it. So if you are interested in hearing hams talk, you'll need a radio that's capable of receiving single sideband or SSB, and often a radio will say so. This particular radio here indicates that it receives on single sideband and by CW. CW means continuous wave, and CW is another word for the use of Morse code, which is another very common amateur radio mode. So if your radio has a BFO switch and usually a BFO pitch knob, or if it has a button that says SSB or single sideband, that means that that radio is capable of tuning in these single sideband and CW signals. So where do you find these transmissions and stations that we've been talking about? I'm going to use this dial here, which I think is very helpful in kind of visualizing exactly where these transmissions are on your radio. And so, for example, let's take a look at this shortwave 1 band here on this particular radio. Now, the 6.0, that is 6 megahertz, and then you see the 7.07 megahertz. But you'll notice on this radio that there's 2 bands nearby, and those are significant. So you'll see this one right here beside the 6.0, 49 meters. It's a solid bar, and that is the shortwave broadcast band. So by international agreement, most shortwave stations operate within that particular band. Now these band limits do change from time to time, as the international agreements shift and change. But you get the idea here. So roughly, if you're in that area, that is where you're going to find those international broadcast stations on shortwave, and those would be almost exclusively in AM mode. If we go a little further up, as we get up toward 7.0 megahertz, you'll see that line there, that bar, is dotted. And on this radio, that's an indication that this is an amateur radio band. So, amateur radio operators are not authorized to operate wherever they like. They are limited to or restricted to certain bands or certain segments of the radio spectrum. Now, this particular one is called the 40-meter band. It's a very popular band on amateur radio, and there's usually activity at any time of the day or night, which makes it a very popular band to listen to. Now, if we go over here to the second shortwave band on this radio, we can just tune around. We'll see here, there's the 25-meter broadcast band right there. And if we go a little further up the dial, we will eventually get to the 20-meter ham band. Okay, so those kinds of transmissions are not spread equally across the shortwave spectrum. They are in smaller segments, and they're fairly predictable. As we go further up, you'll see here's the 19-meter band. Sometimes they overlap. Here's if we go up to this particular band on the radio, we have the 15-meter ham band. You'll see that's dotted around 21 megahertz, and a portion of it coincides with the 13-meter broadcast band. Sometimes those bands overlap, and that can be a little challenging for ham radio operators to negotiate between those stations, but it does happen. So that gives you an idea of where these transmissions are located on your dial. If you want more information about that, you can certainly do a Google search for HF band plan or shortwave band plan, and you'll see all of the different segments and how they are divided up. Now, obviously, the next question is, what about stuff in between those bands? So we've talked about the international shortwave broadcast bands. We've talked about the ham bands. But what about these big stretches here between, say, where there's nothing that's indicated? There's no band that's listed. Well, let's talk a little bit more about that now. Okay, let's talk about the two other categories that I mentioned at the beginning. Utility stations is a pretty broad category, and I have to confess that I am not a big utility shortwave listener. But utility stations is a pretty broad category which covers a lot of ground. Basically, these are shortwave transmissions that serve a very useful purpose, either for navigation, aircraft, marine navigation, also military use. Uses some shortwave frequencies to communicate. There are folks that spend most of their time just monitoring utility stations throughout the shortwave radio spectrum. So you can look up on hfunderground.com and find lots of interesting links, lots more information about utility stations and what you can hear. The trick with utility stations, most of them operate very intermittently. They're not on regular schedules. Again, as utility stations, they operate when they need to operate for whatever purpose they happen to be serving. So it is a bit of a trick and an art to find those stations and to log them. But that might be something you might be interested in, utility stations. The last category, again, is not something that I'm a specialist in by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm just going to count these as mysterious signals. These are things that we don't really know what they are. Sometimes they're kind of test transmissions and frequency sweeps and other strange sounds out there that can be heard, but we don't really know what they are, and they don't really mean anything to us. But they are out there as well. One interesting subset of this mysterious category are called numbers stations. Occasionally you'll hear a station somewhere on the radio dial, often enough outside of the normal broadcasting bands, and it will just be a voice. Usually it's a woman's voice who's just repeating a set of numbers. And kind of constantly repeats a set of numbers for a long period of time. It's believed that those are kind of spy stations, and governments are sending messages to their operatives throughout the world based on a kind of a coded message, a one-time pad where the person could have an ordinary shortwave radio, tune in the frequency, and get their marching orders through this set of numbers. And if you Google shortwave number stations, you will find examples of this, and probably a few recent loggings of shortwave number stations. Well, I hope this little tour of shortwave radio has been helpful to you. Again, there is a wealth of information available online, but usually the best way is to find a decent shortwave receiver and just start listening, and and hopefully you will find it very entertaining and the beginning of a great new hobby. So once again, my name is Tom. This is the Radiodog channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we will get another video out shortly as we continue to journey our way through the wonderful world of shortwave radio. So until next time, take care.